Coronavirus, no going back to normal is the headline. So let's just run through some of the points that they're making in this. Here we go. Life after coronavirus will not feel like life before. It's best that governments acknowledge that and start planning now in order to capture the best that come out of a very tough period, while not raising expectations that life will suddenly snap back to an almost forgotten normal. Have you almost forgotten the normal that was before coronavirus?
No, I certainly haven't. It's getting stronger and stronger, Mike, but I will say that I am now meeting people who seem to be, I hate to use the expression because it's rather unpleasant, but brain dead in their present environment. It's as though that they're now lost in a bubble of the now, and they can't actually remember what real life was like even a few months a year ago, which I find deeply worrying. This is a result of the government's psychological attack on the civilian population in the UK.
Okay, well, let's continue with this then. The virus is not going to disappear, they say, and the government should not raise expectations that it can defeat it. It is clear on current policy that a repository of infection is likely to remain in the population. What's more, the virus will mutate and almost certainly strains resistant to current vaccines will emerge. So the mutations will continue. This is definitely the narrative that's being built. Let's move on. Social distancing and masks will have to remain in some contexts. Pressure for vaccination passports may well grow. Governments will have to find a way of explaining to people how to live with a degree of risk. Now, of course, people were very happy to live with a degree of risk prior to the psychological attack that the British government has put on them. We lived with a degree of risk with flu, with other respiratory illnesses, and people died every year and have died every year and do continue to die from flu, even though the numbers say otherwise. So this is complete nonsense, but anyway, we go on. One of the most difficult questions for government to address will be about permitted travel. So we're getting a clue what's coming in the future. We'll only be allowed to travel when it's permitted. The panoply of outright bans, quarantine rules, demands for tests before and after flying may stay. It's hard to know how. It's hard to see how it will not, given the perpetual chance of new variants, with the potential to spread and the cost of if that did happen. So again, we're getting the variants narrative shoved down our throats. The backlog in the NHS is not just a stack of postponed operations. It may turn out to represent a neglect of illnesses, including cancer and diabetes, being treated at a later stage that would otherwise have happened, with sharply increased demands on health services in the coming years, or much more likely, but not stated here, a sharp increase in the deaths as a result of the lack of healthcare that people getting for non-COVID related incidents. They go on. This goes for children and teenagers too, where the effects of loss of schooling have yet to be fully assessed. Some children will essentially have missed a year of school, and those who have drifted out of contact with any formal part of the education system in that time may never go back. Now, some would argue that perhaps it's not a bad thing that people are drifting out of contact with the formal education system, but on the other hand, in many, many cases, if not most cases, families aren't in a position to fill that gap because they've got to make a living for themselves. So Patrick Henningson's point here is that this actually is probably one of the biggest issues that we face, because it's going to take 12 years for the effects of this to actually get through the education system. We've effectively lost a generation of educated kids for future work environment. But maybe that doesn't matter, Brian, because the fourth industrial revolution means that there isn't going to be any work for them anyway.
Don't want them, don't need to train them. Children are a bit of a problem because they're there and they're growing up, but of course the elderly people they're going to get rid of. Perhaps we should bring Alex in on this one. No normal.
What to say, Brian? I know that you're going to get on to James Delingpole shortly, but a lot of these issues have been sounded out in two vidcasts, as he calls them. The word hasn't really caught on, but podcast with video, that James Delingpole has done with Patrick M. Wood, who's been looking at this technocracy and transhumanism agenda for half a century, since the Trilateral Commission started driving it on behalf of the Bilderberg Group. And in the meat of that discussion, or slightly towards the end, Wood goes into this and says that what's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and by the way, this is also said by the likes of Catherine Austin Fitts, what's meant is that now that we, the humans, are the stock, in previous iterations of world-dominating capitalism, it was land ownership or the ownership of plant or money. Now that we, the human resources, are the capital, some of the stock needs to be upgraded by being computerized internally, and the other needs to be dispensed with. And if you understand that clearly, then you understand also why training and education and culture have to be dispensed with. It's rather ugly to look in the face, but Mr. Wood does a very good job of it.
Okay, well, let's move on with this then, because the Institute for Government goes on. The Westminster government will come under more pressure to grant more powers to the devolved administrations or independence outright. They say in looking at the future of business and worker support, the Treasury will need to consider at some point whether to use benefit system more, as for instance the US has done, to support people's income while avoiding propping up jobs that cannot be sustained. So there's a bit of fourth industrial revolution in this as well, but more importantly, the idea of universal basic income, and also the Mark Carney idea of getting rid of any jobs that don't, because this language that cannot be sustained doesn't mean that can't be kept going. This is about sustainability and the new Green Deal. And if you don't fit into the new Green Deal, as we're going to come on to again in a little bit later, your job is not sustainable. It will not be propped up. So that is what that's about. The government task now is to help mitigate the worst effects and preserve the best, to discuss with people and businesses the level of risk and constraint they're prepared to live with. How much constraint are we prepared to live with? This is really the question that's being asked here, and help them live in a world that has changed. And that's the ultimate point of this, that the world has changed. There's no going back. Now, many people saying, well, the Institute for Government, it's just another NGO, just another mouthpiece. But what's expressed in that document is probably all the major policy points that we've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 years. Certainly all the major policy points that have been raised as a result of COVID are in that document. It's the direction of travel is clear, and I think it would be a mistake to dismiss what's written there.
No, this is one of the think tanks producing policy. So we think the government is running the country, but in reality it's these immensely powerful think tanks that put the policy in, and that comes through. Encourage our audience to get on to the Institute of Government and have a look at who they really are. So if you look at the funding and the collaborators, you'll see you've got the Gatsby Charitable Foundation and you've got Sainsbury's are immediately appearing on your page. And then if you start to scroll down, which I can do here live, we've got Future Care Capital. We've got Microsoft UK, the Wellcome Trust, the Federation of Small Businesses, Unbound Philanthropy, the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, Imperial College. So they've got another foot in the door to help their own policy going. The British Psychological Society, so that's interesting. So there's a foot in the door for the applied psychological science in order to effectively brainwash us, condition us. Royal College of Nursing, PA Consulting, Wales Centre for Public Policy. So this isn't the government in Westminster that's creating these policies, working with the civil service. This is very powerful think tank working with powerful outside global concerns who want these policies brought in, never mind what the voting public wants.